Hello, this is Adam Feinberg, and you are listening to Harlem Stories. Thank you for listening. And, I want to say for those that are listening on a regular basis, thank you for your downloads and your listening. And hopefully I'm delivering content that is worthy of your listening time. And, I try hard, but every day or every topic that we wind up doing, we hope to do something a little different than what everyone else is doing, or at least, for the most part. I mentioned this is Harlem Stories, and, if you haven't listened to any of our episodes previously, we focus on the Upper Manhattan marketplace and the Upper Manhattan neighborhoods, really starting it from the 96th Street, where you get into Manhattan Valley and Bloomingdale neighborhoods, if you get into the Old World neighborhoods, rather than just calling it the northern portion of the Upper West Side. And we go all the way to the very tip top of Manhattan. We talk about architecture. We talk about some of the characters involved that have been historically associated with Harlem, or, some of these stories are in Harlem, Washington Heights, Hamilton Heights, etc. So all these uptown neighborhoods, and we talk about a little bit about the architecture and, some of the unique storylines that we tend to come across uptown. So today's episode, we're going to talk about buyer agent services and a little bit about the background that led us to in where we are today. So many of you, or perhaps even most of you, may have heard about that there was a game-changing lawsuit in terms of, buyer agent commissions. What used to happen is that, for the most part, that these sellers would wind up paying for the buyer's agent commission. And agents, could go out there and say, you know what, there's nothing out of pocket. It's free. When that was never exactly the reality, but it was close. It was one of those things that because the seller was paying for it, it was embedded in the price. Now, could you negotiate this? Yeah, absolutely. But very few people did. And as a result, this was something in our industry that was, let's say just kind of hidden out there. And I think agents could have done a better job, myself included. We could have done a better job, providing transparency in the process, in the cost, in the services, which I believe we failed to do. In any case, looking forward, I don't believe that what the Justice Department the lawsuit was, is that there was this, potential accusation of collusion, between parties. And I got to say, for an industry where very often in a lot of the listings that I wound up working with buyers on, a lot of times I have a hard time just getting them to give me a phone call back. Now, that's not exactly the environment of collusion. That said, I think the issue was more about transparency than, what they were making it out to be. And, what should a buyer's agent service cost? And, I can't get into, the actual percentages here, because that is, something that we can't discuss publicly, but, I'm happy to discuss that offline. But I think more importantly, my goal here today is to kind of give a buyer a sense of what buyer agent services could be or look like. Now, every agent has got a different background, and they could offer potentially something different. So I don't have a fashion background or an interior design background, but I'm sure there's an agent out there that is bundling that or a la carte, going to offer that to buyers. Now, I have a financial background, and I know that's going to be important to the vast majority of my buyers, and how I can wind up applying that. And I think there's a misperception among the public as to what buyer agent services are out there, because the reality is, I think that, and this has probably been proven true is I think that the public thinks that like our job is to open doors and set appointments for them, find properties for them, and that's like 50% of our job. When I would say in reality, that's perhaps just 15%, 15% of our actual job. Maybe it could be argued, maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 20%, but the reality is it's nowhere near the 50% perception point. I want to give my listeners today and, ultimately, how I wind up presenting it to my clients is my services that I bring to the table. And, and I think it's important that, every buyer agent out there, define what it is that they're offering to the public, to their clients. Or potential clients. And, this way, buyers can, identify, what's going to work best for them. So if you're talking about something that's going to need a total interior gut, maybe you're better off working with that agent that either has the connections with interior design firms or has an interior design background themselves. And maybe they're including that as part of their services. So all these things need to be taken into consideration when choosing a buyer's agent. And I don't think that a lot of people necessarily had given this too much thought beforehand. They basically saw, ooh, pretty home, and let's go see it. And and certainly I will definitely admit, I'm like, that's certainly part of the fun part of this job is going to see pretty homes. But at the same time, I also run this as my primary income and as my business. I take it quite seriously. So, for me, naturally, I'm like, I want to really, go into some depth and define what it is that I offer to a client. And I don't know that any necessarily list or rundown or categorization necessarily captures everything for everyone in every instance, because the reality is there is so much variation in what we do. And, there's conversations around, what AI is going to take over our jobs. And the way I really see it is I think I could realistically see as AI as, helping us in our jobs, but not necessarily taking over the role. Just the very many different hats that we're wearing, including really in some way, shape, or form, very often psychologists or psychiatrists. And, we're really a lot of times a shoulder to lean on. And I think that is one of those components that, isn't easily defined. I don't know that I necessarily have that in my list of services, but that is a practical reality. So I break this down into, and I've identified, I believe 7 core categories in which I offer my services. There may be more that I haven't categorized, but at a bare minimum, it helps with the starting point. So if there's a buyer out there that's thinking about like, okay, who do I want representing me? And a lot of times buyers aren't necessarily even defining it that way. They're basically Zillow, there puts them in touch with, somebody, or they have a friend of a friend and, who recommended them, or any number of other scenarios in which they come across some, and they want to get started on a real estate purchase in terms of, this process. So a lot of times they're not necessarily thinking about all these different steps, but now with the decoupling of commissions and buyers, being asked to sign agreements before you get to even realize who your agent really is, you're being already asked to sign an agreement saying, I agree to pay, X percent or X dollars, and working with me on this search. And, any agent worth their salt should really be able to define what it is that you're bringing to the table. They are bringing to the table. And, on that, I've identified the 7 key categories, and I've got that. And just so that I categorize number 1, search and showings, which a lot of people take for granted, and they kind of assume that. On the second part, where people think that this is the other like 50% of our job, is going to be the valuation, offers, and negotiation category. And rightly so, that is a significant amount of, what it is that we do in terms of our job. Obviously that is just one small component of what we do, an important one, but no less, it is just a portion of what we do. The third category I would define as risk assessment and advisement. And I think this is something that a lot of agents out there are afraid to do when they're working with buyers. They basically see something, that is, pretty to look at, that fits a buyer's checkmark needs, but they're not necessarily looking deeper than that. And that is certainly something that is really important to me, especially having come from a finance risk background. And I wanted to make sure that that my buyers understood that I'm looking out for them more than just the purchase. I'm listening to, what their needs are in the long run, what their financial goals are and what they're trying to achieve. So, that is category 3. Category 4 is product knowledge. And, here in New York City, we have some very exotic types of transactions that you don't see commonly everywhere else. Obviously, if you've listened to any other of our episodes, you hear me talk about co-ops and how co-ops represent roughly around 70% or so of our total inventory. But within the world of our products, it's co-ops, it's condos, it's condops, which is a kind of a hybrid of those two, in a sense, and that's the short version. Won't get into all these things. There's condotels. There are SROs. There are townhouses, and the various categories of townhouses. Row houses, brownstones, etc. So there's all these, and then even within it, it's like, do you understand what the products are themselves? So, for instance, up by me in the Hamilton Heights and lower portion of Washington Heights, you have these buildings. They're Riverside Drive condominiums, and they were developed by one sponsor, and they have since kind of changed hands. But at the same time, understanding that even though each one of these buildings is run separately, understanding what is in common with these buildings, and how do we work with them, and how do clients understand each one of these buildings, or as a package deal, what do they need to know? Category 5 I call is the board package and administration grouping, and we'll get more deeper into that. 6 is going to be investments, and obviously I've got a financial background, but in any ways that I can help you into the analytics of so much of what we do, and I'll dive deeper into that as we go on. And then the final category is our internal network, all the different types of people that we network with as real estate agents. And it was kind of eye-opening to me, even though I knew this, but putting pen to paper and trying to define, who our internal network is, it kind of even surprised me. So, now that I've kind of described the core categories, let's do a deeper dive into each one of these, in terms of the services that I offer. And I'm sure every agent can come through and, give you a little bit of a different view depending on their background and their services that they offer. But this is what I bring to the table. So under search and showings over here, the first thing that we want to take into consideration is interpreting your wants, your needs, and also setting expectations. So if I know that a buyer has identified, they want this and they want this and they want this and they want this, and I can tell them, I'm like, well, in the neighborhoods that you're looking for, if you're looking for a high tower, there's only a handful of buildings that are built in Hamilton Heights, in Central Harlem, in East Harlem, that are actually really tall. It's all relative and to the perspective of that. So if you're looking for a 25th floor apartment, That doesn't exist in the overwhelming majority of buildings in Upper Manhattan. So is it possible? Yeah, you're going to be limited to just a handful of buildings. So I like to set those expectations in advance. We'll go through in terms of additional services. We'll go through and get you started on the revenue financials, and that involves pre-qualifying the buyer to ensure that the listings match the buyer's financials. So if a building requires 30-40% down, and then you need to have 2 years post-closing liquidity, and you need to have a debt-to-income ratio of X. All of this, really determines what buildings you're going to qualify for. So if you're looking for, an apartment and it's in a building that you don't have the financial qualifications for, or maybe you do, but you don't necessarily want to tie up that kind of money in terms of, putting such a large down payment down, or, having that much money in post-close liquidity, perhaps those units are not going to be a good match for you. So I do like to kind of, go through the buyer's financials, and we discuss, it's not just like, being able to go and buy a condo and saying, you know what, I have 15% I can put down, and I can find banks that, that might do that, but, most want to see, higher down payments in today's environment. But let's say you were putting 15% down, and that's not going to work in a co-op. So it's important for me to help you set expectations and identify what's real and what's not. Even if you insist, I want to do a lot of the property search myself, and I don't necessarily want to take that into consideration. What I've had clients do is they might be looking online themselves, and they'll send me the listing and say, what do you think about this? And I'll tell them, the various different aspects, and first and foremost, we're going to start off on the financial aspects. But if they're they realize that, especially if they're taking co-ops into consideration, if they realize that what they're doing is not really working well by searching online themselves, because let's say you're looking at one of the large listing sites and they don't really necessarily make it easy to determine, is the building a condo? Is it a co-op? That's one of the things that can help differentiate for you. So I might do a curated search results, and I might add some commentary on a lot of those apartments or homes that we're suggesting. So, I might know something about the building or that block or that neighborhood, and I might add something, to that search that you wouldn't have necessarily known about. Especially true, when I start getting into certain aspects of, specifics within the building. So, the only other category that I tend to do among this now, of course, is the obvious of setting up the showings. But I also like to do a post-showing recap, going over some of the pros and cons, with my buyers, and discussing what will work with them, what won't work with them, and why. And that way, every time we go back to the search table and we start looking for new properties, I'm now taking that feedback into consideration. So that is category one of search and showings, and a lot of people tend to think that is, such a large portion of my job, and in fact, it is certainly a substantial portion. The reality is it's probably about 15% of what I do. Next category of valuations, offers, negotiations. Some of the services that I offer, it includes analyzing the asking price, and I'll incorporate a variety of parameters into it. Does it have outdoor space? What floor number is? What exposure? Are there more than one exposure? How much are the monthlies? And we'll go through all these different things and so much more, when kind of determining, value. A lot of buyers might look at it and say, oh, here's something that looks like a comp, and just because it looks kind of similar finishes and whatnot, but they might not necessarily know that, okay, this building has 60% of it is owned by the sponsor. And as a result, not a lot of banks will want to finance in it. So as a result, this apartment is going to be discounted, even though it looks so much like the other one down the street. So these are things that I'm taking into consideration. The next actual service that I offer under this category is a strategic structuring of the offer and a proper presentation. So, I go through this and, I'm offering the listing broker all the details they need to go back to their client and basically sell me and my client's offer to their client and say, these are the reasons why you should, say yes to this offer, or at a bare minimum, I like this broker because they laid out all the details in one place, the way I can see it in a very concise way. And all these things, and I might get back into, certain details that, that are vital that we might not recognize. So, if this was an SRO, I might, put it into the offer and saying, I'm like, that, my client recognizes that this is an SRO and all that entails. And, that means, if you're buying an SRO, that odds are you're not going to be able to finance much. And, at the same token, that you're going to have to bring in an architect to, redesign the setup of the apartment and to comply to make it a legal 1, 2, 3, 4 family home rather than an SRO where every room is rented out individually. And then I'll go through, with my clients in terms of depending on what they're looking for in terms of to purchase. Are they looking at resales? Are they looking at new construction? Are they considering both? And understand that when you're working with new construction, first off, there's, a lot of the buildings will have their own sheet in terms of, guidance on how they want to see or what they expect to see in an offer. So they might do a tiered down payment program. They might have, and every building is different in how they handle things, but they might have preferred banks and preferred lenders that they want you to use. You don't have to use them, but if you're financing and you want to use any lender of your choice, well, what happens if that lender doesn't want to underwrite? Well, in new construction, you're going to probably need to go to one of their preferred lenders. So these are, these and all these other details, especially in terms of negotiating certain points with new construction. A lot of buyers don't necessarily know about this and how it's handled a bit differently than negotiating in resales. So, in terms of my final point in valuation offers and negotiation, sometimes there's a possibility we may need to renegotiate if needed. Maybe there's a special assessment that wasn't discussed in previously. Maybe there's specific board requirements. So if you're buying in a co-op, sometimes the co-op might want to see they're rejecting, and the whisper that we're getting is that the price is too low. So, we may have to go back and renegotiate and restructure the deal. And, sometimes a price is not a price. And what I mean by that is, not everything is what it seems. Sometimes there are credits in the process. Ultimately, especially in the case of co-ops where you're trying to make one party happy. And that one party could be the board, not necessarily the seller. But it all depends. Every deal is going to be structured differently. Sometimes we also have to contest appraisals and, find out what's going on there. So in terms of the valuation offers negotiation category, there's quite a bit of numerous services that I do tend to offer my clients. The third category, risk assessment and advisement. I mentioned, originally that to me, it's not just about, does the apartment meet all these checklists? It's also about are there other concerns that I'm aware of, at the time or prior to submitting an offer, that I want to go through? And I might take a look at Department of Buildings filings. I might be advising on how building conditions can impact you. So, for instance, are the reserves sufficient, or are they collecting, enough on a monthly basis through the common charges or the monthly maintenance to build up proper reserves? Is there a building mortgage, and how does that affect you? Things of that nature. One thing that I encounter often in terms of Upper Manhattan that you're not going to find so much many other places in the city. Maybe you'll see it in Brooklyn, Queens, but in terms of Manhattan, you're really not going to see many tax abatements anymore. But in Upper Manhattan, you can still find some that have many years remaining on the abatement, a lot of times buyers are going to ask me, well, what happens when the tax abatement ends? What are my taxes going to look like? And the reality is I can't answer that question because we don't know what tax policy will be in the future. And we only know that what the taxes could be if there was no abatement today. And I can help you figure that out in terms of condos that still have a tax abatement. And, finally over here, it's important to understand the common charge or maintenance structure. Now, a lot of times I might not necessarily have the building financials until we have an accepted offer. But, sometimes I can tell by the size of the building and, or having done deals in the building in the past, I'm like, how does the building tend to operate? Now, things can change from year to year as, board members change and they might have different philosophies. But, if I'm looking at a small building, and I've seen enough small buildings to get a better sense of what could be a reasonable common charge structure, and it depends. Do they have a building's managing agent? Does the building have an elevator? These are two items that are really expensive that add to the bottom line in small buildings. So, these are things that I also think are good things, and they're important to have. I don't want to, misconstrue or misconvey anything. I just want to make sure that buyers, understand that there is a difference in the cost structure in those kinds of buildings. And it's important, Dave, if I see a building where I think the common charges are too low, my advisement over here is don't take any extreme level and saying, we should not consider this because, I feel like it's too low and maybe there's too much resistance. Well, my recommendation in this is, number one, know that it's possible other owners could struggle if common charges are raised too much too quickly. Or alternatively, I also recommend that buyers, what they do is they set aside some money in some sort of savings account that basically works as forced savings for the common charges that are not being offered, or special assessment that we know because the building routinely does it every 2 years, and things of that nature. And these are things that I will go over with my buyers. So now we get into the product knowledge category, and we're getting into some specifics that you want your agent to really have a decent sense of. They're not going to know every building, or at least with the exception of just a handful of brokers in the industry. For the most part, you might know as an agent, you might know quite a lot about a lot of the buildings, but there's no way you're going to know just about every single building unless you've been doing this forever. In which case that is a rare thing to find, but. In any case, what I recommend is obviously you're working with an agent that really knows the neighborhood well. So what I do with my buyers, a lot of times, especially because they tell me, I'm like, I don't really know the neighborhood. I don't necessarily want to buy somewhere, without necessarily really having a better sense of it. So what I do, I go back and say, what? Why don't we take a neighborhood walking tour? And I can, combine a little bit of history and a little bit of interesting things to see and do. And we can also talk real estate along the way, and I can point out some, buildings that may or may not be a good option for you, but at least you start getting a better sense of the neighborhood. And that's something that I happily do with all of my clients. In fact, I do it with agents too. A lot of agents will come to me and say, I don't really know these neighborhoods. I'm like, can you tell me more about it? And I said, I can do better. I can show you, and we can do a walking tour. So that's certainly one aspect of it. And, we can go through. And one of the things I've done in my specialty practice that I don't know if it necessarily a lot of agents do, but certainly I know some of the better agents and kind of have a decent sense of this. They might go through and say, they hear what a buyer is looking for. They might have a specific list of potential buildings to go down. So if a buyer says, I want a building that has a swimming pool, well, in Upper Manhattan, that's not exactly common, so we can narrow it down to just a handful of buildings. But, what if there's you're looking for parking for purchase and things of that nature? So, maybe it's a washer dryer that is vented, or you want central air. These are all things that I've taken into consideration and have done, searches for. And if I haven't, it's something that I'm willing to undertake because I know that I can use it, for multiple clients. So these are among those things that I'm doing, but it's also the building specifics themselves in terms of their financials. So, we've talked about this, a few moments ago in terms of, curating search results and that, but I'll go through building specific components and financials. So the down payment amounts, a conservative versus a liberal co-op, co-ops that, you can sublet in, freely. So all these things are things that I can that I'll go through and consider. And a lot of times, again, clients will, even though I've got a search set up, maybe they find something they get all excited about, and they're like, "Tell me more about this," and I will tell them more about it. So we go through these kinds of things, and I'll walk them through these kind of building specific components. The buyer financials that are needed, if that applies, and things of that nature. And one final category about product knowledge that I'll go into, and I think this can go into, the evaluation offer and negotiation stamp bucket as well. But I have, as an agent and as a full service agent and a premium agent, I have access to market intelligence tools, and I know not every agent is a subscriber of these kinds of things. So I go into valuation insights, market dynamics. If we're looking at new construction, I might go into the shadow inventory and things of that nature. So I think that gives you a decent sense of on the product knowledge side of the equation. From there, we jump into board package and administrative functions and things of that nature. Things that I don't personally love to do, but it is a vital aspect of the job. So you might be working on preparing and submitting a condo and co-op application. Now, I've had buyers, especially in condos, where the agents have done nothing on this end, and it winds up getting rejected, and it winds up going back to the buyer and the buyer's agent to redo it, and that's because they're not doing it necessarily in a professional manner. I've seen a lot of buyers that have been shortchanged in this process of not doing it professionally. It takes longer. It's more effort ultimately in the long run because they're doing things twice. So a lot of those things that's baked into the services that I offer. And I'll freely offer my board package staff in terms of working with our buyers and whatever it is that they need, or even if I'm on the listing side and the buyer's agent needs somebody that can put together the board package, I can certainly offer that as well. However, don't want to get too far off track. We're talking about buyers today, not on the sell side, but and what I can offer. But it's also important things like coordinating with the managing agent and the board is needed. So especially more needed so in co-ops than condos, but certainly don't want to underplay that role in condos either. But sometimes just trying to get a decent sense of what a buyer might qualify for. These are certainly important aspects of what we're looking at. We'll go through, and finally, especially in co-ops, extraordinarily rare to have a condo that does a board interview, in which case they are forced to approve you. So I don't think a condo board interview process is all that vital, but happy to do it if we come across that rare building that absolutely says we should be doing this, or we have to do this. But what we'll do is we'll go through a mock co-op board interview, and we'll actually even go through some scenarios based off of your own financials. And this is something that we dig deep into your board package and your personal situation. So, for instance, a question that a buyer might be asked, and I'll role play this with them. And, what happens if there have been job cuts from your company that have been in the news recently, and the company has indicated that there's probably more coming? How do you wind up making a board feel comfortable knowing that if this is in the news, they could stumble on it and they could have genuine concerns? I'm like, is this buyer going to be able to, to pay for this apartment on a monthly basis, or do we have to worry about default? In which case, we might not want to approve the buyer. So we'll go through and we'll do a mock interview of, these aspects. And finally, there's usually some form of state paperwork involved in the process, fair housing, and there's another state disclosure as well in terms of agency relationships and buyers understanding that. And I walk through buyers in terms of that. And now there's obviously that buyer's agreement. So, that fully covers that board package administrative component. Next, we get into the category of investments. And obviously, we'll get into, the most simple stuff, buy versus rent review. But then we'll, depending whether you're thinking about investing. And a lot of times, I'll get two different categories of investors reach out to me. There's the professional investors, and then there's the people that want to diversify their money but don't have a whole lot of experience in real estate investing, and they don't necessarily know what their goals are. And I'll help them clarify what their goals, what they want out of an investment property. So they might not have thought about it too deeply before, but certainly by the time we get off the phone, I'd like them to have at least some clarification as to what to expect going forward, and what their goals are. Is it cap rate? Is it wealth preservation and inflation hedge? Is it portfolio diversification? Cash flow or passive income? So we'll go through all these different, types of scenarios and what their objective might realistically be or look like in buying a property in Upper Manhattan or elsewhere for that matter. But certainly that's part of it. We'll talk about things, and I don't like getting too deep into this because it is such a technical topic, but at least, want to get into it with buyers if they aren't familiar and they are basically selling one property, looking to buy a new one, both as investments. So if the original property was already being used as an investment for a few years, we could talk about 1031 exchanges and basically how it is basically an opportunity to delay your taxes, in essence, is what it is. Ultimately you'll still have to pay it, but hopefully it's really more as a generational wealth tool. So, you're pushing that tax liability down the road, and hopefully at a lower number at a different point in time. So, we'll get into that a little bit. And in terms of the details, I always direct somebody to a 1031 exchange specialist. And then finally, we might get into, depending on who the client might be, developer services. We'll connect you with tech products, excuse me, that you might not already be familiar with. Final category that we want to talk about is our internal network. Now, I was kind of surprised when thinking about this, breaking it down. In New York City, you need to have a transactional attorney. But, very often, as agents, we come across so many different types of scenarios. So we might, not just need like the traditional real estate transactional attorney, but it might also be litigation attorneys. I've had one deal that almost needed one, but thankfully not. There's landlord-tenant attorneys, and then, sometimes we'll just get asked for all sorts of other attorneys, tax attorneys, things of that nature as well. These are that category over there. We can be introduced to accountants, all those in the remainder of the financial world, accountants, financial advisors, foreign exchange currency transfer partnerships, tax certiaries, credit repair advisors, 1031 qualified intermediaries. Like all those different types of financial advisory components over there. And of course, when you're buying a home, while in Manhattan, it's pretty common to buy in cash. But if you're not, we have a variety of mortgage bankers that we can connect you with that's right for your particular situation. And keep in mind, in Manhattan, it's not easy if you call the call center that's in the Midwest and on the back of your bank statement, or they send a little flyer insert with your bank statement. Ultimately, not saying that like you can come in with your own banker. In fact, I certainly recommend it. But you want that banker to be local, or at least at a bare minimum have local knowledge. I had one instance where I had a banker that owned an investment property on Union Square, and yet he was somewhere in the Midwest. So when I first heard, I'm like, my banker, lives in Indiana. I was kind of surprised that when he knew, Manhattan real estate, and he knew the quirks of it. So, I think certainly that is an important aspect to understand is, the banker doesn't necessarily need to be local. They need to understand the local market. And that's an important thing. So, and it's important to connect up the buyer with the right situation. So whether they're a first-time buyer, maybe they're a foreign national, in which case I'll recommend banks, or credit unions such as like the United Nations Federal Credit Union, which is available to people outside there. So people, the public, can join it, not a problem. So great for foreign nationals, portfolio lenders that do all the things that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac won't underwrite in, which is Fannie and Freddie will underwrite in the majority of the nation, but here they won't. But then finally, the last category over here are various service professionals. So we get into working with inspectors and insurance agents and contractors and movers and storage and architects and interior designers. And I'm sure there's more that I'm leaving off this list, but it gives you a better sense of, of all the various different types of professionals that we are in contact with on a regular basis. And we never know who we're going to get requests for. Sometimes it's closet organizers, or, what about painters that specialize in, painting rooms where, they actually will move things around. Not all painters will do that. Or they'll do it room by room, so that the client can still remain living in the apartment, but they don't have to clear everything out of the apartment in order to get it painted. So we do get like kind of these specialized requests even among subcategories of these things. Well, thank you for listening to me today. I wanted to give you a sense of, of what I offer for buyer agent services. But, more importantly, or just as importantly, is, to understand what each agent is really willing and able to offer their client base, because it might not work for you. And, just understand that, interviewing a buyer's agent is something that is important, because not every agent can be everything to everyone. Well, with that, thank you very much for listening to Harlem Stories, and we hope to interest you in our next Harlem story. Thank you. Have a great day.